Good afternoon, it is 2:30 p.m. It is Monday, November the 16th, 2020. My name is Arran Hunt, I'm a partner here at Trans-Tasman and I head up the Migration Partners team. As always, this video does not contain legal advice, it is just an update on what's happening with immigration in New Zealand. If you're looking for legal advice, please come give us a call, give us an email, we'll see what we can do. Now, firstly, apologies for not providing an update recently. I've been unwell. I've been tested. It's not COVID-19, thank goodness. I'm not 100% yet, but I am getting back there. We have also had many big announcements out of the government or INZ in the last 2 weeks. So this video is more of an update covering a few items that have come up and that a few that we've seen discussed within the immigration industry. So it's going to be relatively short and quick. First thing is we'll start with managed isolation and quarantine, which is MIQ as we call it, as this is still a major factor in any decision the government makes. Now, as you'll know, everyone that comes to New Zealand needs to spend 2 weeks in MIQ, which needs to be booked in advance. Now, due to the large number of Kiwis who are coming home, that means the MIQ is booked out for some months in advance. Now, just last week we saw MIQ being booked out till mid-February, so 3 months out from the date we looked into it. However, the government appears to have now sourced more hotel rooms from mid-January, meaning that 18th of January is now the first available date, bringing forward by a month that date, which is fantastic news because we need to get more of this isolation in place. But basically means that unless you pre-book, you're looking at a 2-month wait for MIQ once a visa is granted. Now, if you do pre-book MIQ, you're sort of be hoping that the visa comes through in time, otherwise you're going to miss that slot. So we're not sort of encouraging that, but that's sort of how that's working. Now, there are continued talks between Australia and New Zealand about creating a travel bubble between the two countries. At present, New Zealanders can travel from New Zealand to several Australian states without needing to quarantine when they get to that state, but not all of them. Now, but coming in reverse, that's not allowed. Come to New Zealand, you have to go into MIQ. Now, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, who is the person who's sort of the face of, I suppose, of COVID-19 in New Zealand. It's not the best place to describe him. He's done an amazing job. Now, he has said that the threshold has been that there's 28 days of no community transmission in Australia. And now that is a really high threshold for them to meet before we'll look at that. So they're looking at reconsidering as to what that threshold is going to be. But Australia seems to have this view that 10 cases in the community is acceptable, when New Zealand doesn't have that view. We had one case a few days ago here in Auckland, and the following day we had a city that was almost deserted, people working from home. So we see any case in the community as being worthy of sort of acting strongly upon. Australia, it is a larger country, but for them 10 cases is acceptable. For us, 10 cases would result in a lockdown taking place, as we've seen in the past few months. So there is sort of needs to be an agreement there as to how that's going to work, but at the moment that's not sort of looking likely. However, if one was created, and it will appear at some point, it would mean a rolling impact to a number of areas. Now, most of the use of MIQ is from New Zealand citizens and residents, and the largest numbers of those are coming from Australia. Now, if they no longer needed to go through MIQ, then that would mean thousands of additional spaces in MIQ opening up. So it would mean no more booking months in advance. That would probably be an ability to book days in advance rather than months. Now, the government would then be able to look at potentially offering other border exceptions, as the pressure currently is basically on MIQ. They can't sort of roll out more border exceptions to other categories because MIQ is so full. What if that pressure was relieved of the current system, that would give them that allowance. So even if you aren't flying to New Zealand from Australia, it's worth keeping an eye on whether a Trans-Tasman bubble is created, as that's going to bring in a number of changes elsewhere in immigration. And one of the first of those is going to be most likely student visas. There was hope in the industry that something would happen to allow students to return for the start of next semester, being February, March 2021. However, nothing has come from the government, and we've actually seen education providers writing to enroll students who are supposed to start at that point and ask them to move their enrolments back to July. So the industry view is now that is not going to take place, and we're looking now at July as being probably the start of the next year for foreign students. Now, with MIQ at capacity, any plan to allow students in just couldn't take place. There was an earlier announcement some weeks back, and this has actually been raised again in the media in the last few days, about 250 PhD students that would be allowed to enter. Now we want to make it clear here that these are students who are already living in New Zealand, they're working on their PhD and needed to be in New Zealand to complete their practical work for their PhD so that those years of work did not go to waste. Now this was not an offer to new students. They were already established students already living in New Zealand and working on their PhDs, and many who probably would have gone through perhaps doing a bachelor's, then a master's, then their PhDs, maybe 7, 8, 9 years in the country. Now out of those 250 spots that were available, 197 were taken up, which means there's still 53 spots that weren't taken up. Now from the original government release from about a month or two ago, the rest would now be offered to master's students in the same situation where they need to be in the country to do their practical work, and they were already effectively living in the country anyway. We haven't seen where that's going, but at least they've given some student visas out, if only to those small numbers. And it's not so much giving them a visa, it's giving them the right to enter the country. They would already have had visas in most cases. Now in the last video we touched on one of the parts of the Labour Party manifesto, being the partnership visa criteria. Now Labour of course now form the current government on their own, and on the final tally of the voting figures, they gained 50% of the vote and the majority of the seats in Parliament. So they do run the country on their own without needing other parties to help them out. We wanted to confirm quickly mention a couple of the other parts from the manifesto that have been brought to our attention through discussions within the industry in the last week. Now first is that Labour will ensure that immigration policies work in the best interest of New Zealand, Pacific migrants and Pacific Island nations, including consideration for climate-related migration policies. Now this is a new policy, but one that has been discussed previously. New Zealand is proud about being part of the Pacific and works closely with many of our island neighbours. With climate change, those islands are being impacted pretty severely. So New Zealand is looking at what may become more common, a climate refugee situation. We've actually seen several cases in the courts in New Zealand, people claiming climate change refugee status, but all of those ones that I've been through and read through were unsuccessful. But this is something we are going to see in the future, both New Zealand and offshore. So it's interesting to see the Labour Party sort of front-footing that at what is going to take place in the future. Now the other one we want to touch on was the parent category visa, which we did mention quickly in the last video. Now we did mention that Labour wants to reduce the barriers to that visa, which would probably most notably be the high salary requirements for the sponsor. Now we've heard from distinguished Professor Paul Spoonley, who talks a lot about, he's a sociologist, talks a lot about immigration and impact, and he made interesting note that the manifesto states that they will be doing this once the international flow of people across the border settles. Now look at the words there, the international flow across the border settles. Now Professor Spoonley doesn't believe that this will take at least 3 years to take place, which would push back that policy by some time. Now of course we are working with a lot of guesstimations here. Professor Spoonley definitely knows his stuff, but I think we all admit that it is a moving target. We don't know what things are going to take place. We would agree that 2 or 3 years before our borders return to how they were, or at least how we travelled previously, is going to be very likely. The professor did mention that, I think it was Heathrow in London, so one of the world's biggest airports, looked at 2024 as being the year they got back to how things were prior to 2020. So they're looking at a 4-year to return to the status quo. And it wouldn't surprise us if perhaps not 4 years, but 3 years does not seem unreasonable before we start seeing the world going back to how it was. And that, of course, will possibly impact when Labour bring through this policy. And finally, we wanted to just touch on the only recent update from Immigration New Zealand, and that's around working holiday visas. Now typically these are granted between April and September or October and March. They're done in sort of 2 batches depending on where people are coming from. Now, for those of you who don't know, a working holiday visa gives those the right, under the age of 30, the right to come to New Zealand for most of them for 1 year. They can work for that year, travel around. It gives them a chance to experience New Zealand. New Zealand has similar agreements with a number of countries. A lot of New Zealanders go to the UK to do what they call their OE, the Overseas Visa Experience, and this visa allows them to sort of do it the same way coming back. Now, these are often a good way to come to New Zealand to try things out. However, with the border closed, they were not able to grant these visas. So the April to September applications that were taking place this year did not go ahead because the border was closed. The October to March applications, the intake has been indefinitely postponed because, of course, the border is still closed. Immigration New Zealand said they will review it again in 2021. They didn't say when in 2021, but we'd expect it to be sometime after March. So the group that's supposed to start in October to March, those applications we do not believe will not go ahead. You're now looking at some point next year, perhaps they may make the applications starting again. The April to September applications next year, 2021, we're still doubtful. The border will probably still be closed in April. It might be the October to March 2021-2022 applications are the next ones we see, but we'll know more next year closer to the date. And that is all we have for today. We'll do another video this Friday, we think, with more news from Immigration New Zealand, possibly around skilled migrant visas. Until then, kia kaha and stay safe.